Well, g'day fishers, Brent from Tackle World Port Stephens, and as promised, we're going to do another fishing and tackle basics talk, I guess. And the talk I'm going to give today is something that I used to do when I was a young fella, when I was about, I guess, from the age of 8, 9, 10. And at this time of year, through April, through May, even through the winter months. And it's a species that I guess everybody can go and target. That's the good old yellowfin bream. So what I'm going to show you today is a real basic technique that I used to use and I still use today, targeting bream basically on baits and fishing a very easy rig that anybody can actually do. So I used to cut my teeth when I was a young fella down at the Nelson Bay breakwall, and especially in the winter time, and nailing big fat bream that used to, well they still do I guess, get up and sit along that rock wall with the ludrick. The ludrick never interested me when I was a young fella, but the bream did. The bream, I reckon, fight a little bit harder and in some ways probably a little bit easier to catch as well. And I could get away from the crowds along the wall there and get my own little spot. So today I'm going to talk about catching bream, especially on bait, and how I do it. It's a very, very simple rig. And like I said, anybody can do, especially here in Port Stephens. We've got plenty of rock walls and plenty of areas that we can go and actually target bream. And bream are a little bit of a scavenger. They will eat anything, but there's probably 2 or 3, 4 baits that I reckon are key to it. I reckon bream like an oily bait, fleshy bait that works really well. Prawns do work sometimes, but I'll show you a couple of baits that I've got here that I reckon are number one for bream in Port Stephens. And you can actually do this technique shore-based, but you can also do it out of the boat as well. So great little technique. In fact, when I got a tinny when I was about 12 or 13, I used to go and do this around the oyster racks and the rock walls inside the bay. So I'm a little 12-foot tinny, used to go and venture out and catch the bream this way as well. So very, very simple technique that I'll run through now. So with the hooks, what I've found over the years, probably the best hook is the good old bait keeper hook or bait holder. So they're the Gamakatsus in a 1/0. You can either use a size 1 or 1/0, but I reckon by far the best hook for bream fishing with bait in Port Stephens. I also use them on drummer as well. So the good old bait holder or bait keeper hook, Gamakatsus I find the best, chemically sharpened there with those little bait keepers, and I'll explain that a little bit later. The other thing you'll need is a little bit of leader. Now, back in the day when I used to do it, there wasn't anything called braid. It was all monofilament, and I still fish monofilament today. It's a little bit easier, but you can fish braid. A lot of people now have braid on their rods and reels because using this technique, it doesn't have to be anything fancy. In fact, I use a 2,500 size reel, and like I said, you can use braid, light braid, 4 to 6 pound, but you must run a leader off it. And probably the leader I start out with is a bit of 6 pound fluorocarbon, but some days I have had to go up to about 8, 9, 10 pound. But I try and stay as light as I can, and the 6 pound is the way to go, especially off the rock wall down here. By any means, you will lose big bream. Unfortunately, they have a habit of running into the oysters, and you will lose them, but that's just part of fishing. So you've got to go light to get the bite, and that's the key to it. So yes, like I said, you can use your braid and join that that braid to the leader. But the other important thing, I reckon, is, believe it or not, how you present this bait, and basically the rig that I use. You want to use as light a weight as possible. Sometimes when the smaller tides, like we've got at the moment, you can actually get away with no weight at all, especially on the rock wall. But you do have to add some sort of bit of lead because there is current involved. And the heaviest I'll use is either a size 0 ball sinker or up to about a size 1. If I can get away with a size 0, that's the number one the one that I'll use all the time, the size 0 ball sinker. Okay. Fishing tides is important. I like to fish the incoming tide, the last 2 hours of the incoming tide, and you'll find there'll be a bite period with the bream. Once you get to the top of that tide, I'll actually slacken off, and I don't mind fishing the bottom of the tide, so the last 2 hours of the run-out tide. Okay, so flow is important for bream. They're a scavenger fish, like I said, so they'll just sit there in the current, in schools, and hunt for their baits. And presenting that bait as unweighted as possible. Don't especially on the rock walls. They won't sit on the bottom, they'll feed mid-water. So try and fish as light as possible. Now the rig is very, very simple. There's no swivel involved. If you've got nylon, 6 pound or 8 pound nylon, it's very simple, no swivel at all. And with the braid to that leader join, it's the leader. And the simple rig is just sinker, free running to the hook. Don't fix the sinker, allow that sinker to stay free running. That is the best rig that I've ever used bait fishing for Bream in Port Stephens. Just a simple sinker. And it's easy, kids can do it, adults can do it. And to be honest with you, fishing off the ocean rocks as well, this is a good technique off the ocean rocks, is the best way. Like I said, those fish feed mid-water. They're not feeding hard on the bottom, they're feeding mid-water. So you want to present that bait as natural as possible through the water column. And the other big thing as well is if you're fishing tide, don't just cast straight out into the tide, cast up current and allow that bait to naturally float down with the current. Once the current starts to pick that bait up or you line up, wind it in, do it again. It's always, you want to consistently move that bait around. You just don't want to leave there. It's active fishing, and that's the best way to do it. So that is the simplest rig that you can use, I reckon. And you'll pick up other species. I've caught plenty of tailor. I've hooked dewies on this rig, but it is a deadly, deadly technique for bream. Simple ball sinker, straight to the hook. You won't get a better rig than that. Now the baits that I use, there's a few different baits that I use. Like I said, I love an oily bait, fleshy bait. Yeah, I've used prawns before. I've heard of people using cooked prawns, but there's probably 3 to 4 baits that I actually use that I reckon are number one. One that I've used for years is the good old salted mullet fillet. Okay, there you go, cryovac. Salted mullet fillet. We sell it here in the shop. We cryovac it, we salt it, ready to go. So plenty of mullet around the moment, but I like to salt it because it toughens that bait up. You'll get a few pickers down on the breakwall there, and you want to get through them. Salted mullet fillet. The other bait, which we sell a lot of, salted bonito fillet. Love this bait, fantastic. I've caught big flatties, I've caught snapper, and most importantly, I've caught plenty of bream on it. Okay. And the good thing about these baits being salted, they will last. If you don't use it all, put it back in the freezer. Okay. Salted bonito fillet. But another one that I used to use a lot of, good old salted pilly. Caught plenty of good fish on a good old salted pilly, and I'll show you what I'll do there in a sec. Now another bait that fishes really well is the herring. Okay, we're lucky enough to get a steady supply of herring, but bream love herring. So they're probably my 4 best baits that I use on the bream here in Port Stephens. That's both in the estuary and off the rocks, around the racks, around the rock walls. If you're in the boat, same technique, anchor up and fish those unweighted baits down the edge of or parallel to the oyster racks. But to present that bait properly, what I actually do is I cut those baits up. So with a salted pilchard, cutting it up live, there you go, is the tail sections I reckon are the best, but you can use the middle part, the body. So what you want to do when you present that bait is you don't want to cover the hook completely. You want to have that hook exposed. So what I normally do, you'll see the dark line down the edge of the bait. That's actually the backbone of the pilchard. What I normally do there is just hook it through the top there, nice and lightly, hook it through again, and lay that hook along the bait there. So you've got plenty of hook exposed. If you don't have it exposed, you're not going to catch the fish. Okay, so you've got to have that bait exposed. It's the same with a piece of mullet, brine mullet. You only want a little cube, about 1 inch long, 1/2 inch wide. Same with a fillet of bonito. And the herring, well, the herring is pretty much similar to your brine pilchard. Okay, the brine pilly, nice and tough bait, as you can see there. It's not breaking apart. You get a frozen pilchard out of the packet, they'll fall apart. Whereas a good old brine pilchard, they're nice and tough. And like I said, with those fillets as well. So the good thing about that, other than a prawn or anything else, is they're going to withstand those smaller fish picking at it until a bream comes through and eats it. Now, another little trick that I like to tell people is when you're fishing for these bream, is I like to let them swallow it. So in other words, what I like to do is fish with the bail arm open so I've got loose line, okay? When a bream picks it up, they'll whiz off really quick, let them eat it, flick your bail arm over, then strike. So that's another good tip I like to do, especially if you're fishing shallow water out of the boat, the oyster racks and the rock walls. Have that bail arm open and actively fish that bait back towards that structure. Rod-wise, if I'm fishing off the breakwall, I like to fish an 8 to 10 foot rod. If I'm out of the boat, just your standard 2 to 4 kilo 7 foot rod. That's all you need. So that's a little basic bream tip. It's getting into that time of year. Once we get into May and the winter, The bream will really hit their straps down in the lower half of the bay. And to be honest with you, I cut my teeth as a young fella here in Port Stephens catching those bream on baits. So it's a fantastic, great fun, and a great way to get a feeder fish as well. So that's our tackle tip for this week. We'll have another one. Keep your tips rolling in. There's a few good ones there we're going to get to. Trying to do at least one a week. So there you go. So catching bream on baits this week. We'll see what we can do next week.